So this lecture is for Chapter 6, Infant Nutrition. This will round out Unit 1 for nutrition across the lifespan. So before we get started, I want to specify that the actual age range we're talking about here for their nutritional needs and recommendations is ages 0 to 1 year. After that year point, their needs as far as the types of foods that we feed them, the way that we feed them, the nutrition recommendations changes. So we'll talk in the next unit about early childhood, those toddler and preschool years, but right now we're talking about babies. So one thing that I want to make sure everyone knows, particularly if you were going to go on to work somewhere like the health department or work as a dietitian, or work with kids at all in any way, the way that we know if children are receiving adequate nutrition is by physical growth assessments, which typically happen at a pediatrician's office or a health department. A lot of the things from 0 to 1 that we measure, typically we are looking at weight as being the most important assessment. However, their length, which is a different way to think about height, because typically we look at them laid out recumbent for that and stretched out. And head circumference as well are also critical measurements. And typically we plot these on growth charts. So when I was doing my undergrad in nutrition, this was one of the things we actually had to do, is plot on growth charts. So I'm not going to make you do that, but I at least want you to look over the charts in the book and be familiar with a way to read it. A lot of times in doctors' offices and health departments now, those measurements that are taken are put into the computer, and the growth chart for that specific infant is populated. It used to be that we had to actually plot it on the chart, but it is important to know about the charts and be familiar with them. So for 0 to 1, there's going to be a difference in gender. So you're going to choose a different chart for boys and a different chart for girls. And there are different charts you could look at. So for example, this one here is weight for age. So thinking about how many months that baby is, which you can actually see on the x-axis, and then what their weight is. So we should anticipate, as you see the curve there, that as a baby ages in months, that their weight would also increase. Now, there are other things we can look at, like head circumference for age, which same thought process, length for age, same thought process again, but another one that we actually look at is weight for length. So thinking about how a baby is maybe built, if you want to think about it that way, like how tall they are in comparison with their weight. So typically when they assess infants, you'll see a multitude of charts that they'll talk you through. Now, the context of these charts is this. Typically babies are seen anywhere from once a month to once every couple months during that first year of life by the pediatrician. So their growth is very closely followed. What these charts actually say with this 3rd, 5th, 10th is that you are comparing the child that you are measuring to all of the other babies for that age, for that gender in the United States. So let's say, for example, this baby looks to be small for gestational age, which that true definition is less than 10% on that percentile. Once we drop below 3rd%, we're concerned about failure to thrive. But what that actually means, let's say that baby is 3 months old. So we would make a point at the 3 months, and let's say that baby is maybe 6 pounds. When you connect those 2 points, you would see that baby is in the 3rd percentile. So only 3% of babies born in the United States weigh less than this baby. Okay, that's kind of the way you have to think about it. Typically, we don't get really super caught up on this unless babies are in these particular outliers. So that small for gestational age plots anything below the 10th percentile. If a baby is large for gestational age, they plot above the 90th. The other thing that you will see people get really caught up on is if kids really make a huge jump from one visit for the other. So let's say, for example, this baby plots at third percentile because he or she was 6 pounds at that 3-month mark. Now, let's say at 6 months, even though it would be a positive thing, let's say baby weighs almost 10 pounds. So that baby is going to majorly jump percentiles in a very short period of time. We typically don't want to see those huge spikes and drops. We typically want to see this very similar curve you see here. You may see them jump from like 50th to 25th or 50th to 75th. That's not terrible, but some of these huge spikes in a short time period would be concerning. So there are actually 2 different charts to make it even more confusing. I'm not going to expect that you memorize this. I don't think I even put this on the exam. But in case you happen to work in the health department, there may be some discussion about what type of charts are used. So just be familiar with the fact that there are 2 different types. There's the CDC, and then there's some developed by the WHO. The difference a lot of times is the WHO can be really good for babies that are breastfed, because as we talked about before, breastfed babies tend to grow differently, and so the WHO ones have been found to be a little bit better for babies that are breastfed. Okay, so let's talk about infant mortality. Anybody that had community health, I kind of expect for you to understand this concept, but for those of you who did not, the infant mortality rate is an estimate of the number of infant deaths which occur within the first year of life for every 1,000 live births. Now, why do we care about this other than the fact that it's really sad? Because infant and maternal mortality rates a lot of times give a good sense of that country's healthcare system. So you don't want to see moms and babies dying in that pregnancy or in that first year of life, because typically that speaks to how we're taking care of that maternal health care system. Unfortunately, even though we have one of the most expensive healthcare systems in the world, we are actually ranked below other wealthy developed countries. We have really, really poor infant mortality and maternal mortality rates in this country. Top 3 causes that we tend to see in the United States that contribute to the infant mortality rate are birth defects, low birth weight or preterm births, and sudden infant death syndrome. So because we have such poor infant mortality rates in our country, it is one objective for Healthy People 2020. And so you see on here that Healthy People 2020 is trying to actually specifically address some of those issues that we see. So reducing preterm births, reducing low birth weight, reducing fetal death. And then the other thing that we've already talked about is that initiative to breastfeed, which we know actually is associated with less death rates in the first year of life. So the slides did not originally have this in it, but I thought it was really important to define some of these terms that we're using a lot related to babies. They're terms that you almost always use if you're working with infants. You'll be asked about if you or your partner ever have a baby, and it's whether babies are full term, and that is actually defined as when infants are 37 or between 37 and 42 weeks of gestation when they're born. So as long as you hit 37 weeks, you are considered to have a full-term baby, which, as we know, has better health outcomes. Preterm is defined as any infants born before 37 weeks of gestation, which we know comes with negative health outcomes. And then low birth weight is actually defined as less than 5.5 pounds at birth. So another way that we gauge whether or not infants are growing and progressing the way they should is looking at development. And one of those ways is thinking about motor development and what babies are able to do at different stages. Now, I will go ahead and tell you that this chart shows best case scenario. There are babies that do things later There are babies that do things earlier. There are babies that do some earlier and some later. There really is no rhyme or reason. Parents a lot of times will express great concern over some of these not being within those strict parameters. But the reality is some of these have a really wide window for when babies do it. So I try to remind parents that this is just like a good guide, but a lot of times we give a little bit more grace on the front and the back end. We really don't worry about babies not being able to walk until they're about 2 years old. If they're not walking, that's when we start to have a conversation. So some of the motor development things that we're looking for with babies, as you can see, they increase with difficulty. So once they learn one thing, they typically will move on to the next thing. So rolling over a lot of times happens between 2 and 3 months, but there can be a lot of variation in that. Baby starting to bear some weight on legs typically happens, it could be anywhere from 3 to 7 months, really. And that's when we start to see babies in the little activity centers and bouncing. And so they're learning to put some of their own body weight on their legs. And then it's sitting without support. Sometimes you'll see babies actually sit with support for quite a while first. That can be really helpful to learn to sit without support. Then you have this concept called creepers, which is sometimes pulling themselves up on furniture and standing, or sometimes even scooting along using the piece of furniture as a way to hold themselves up. And then they start learning how to stand alone and walk alone. And so when we talk to parents, we try not to get completely caught up on those dates again, but it is really important that that is another way that we kind of try to see, are babies ready to feed, as we'll talk about in just a minute, and are they growing appropriately? So one important thing that I know will be on your exam is this concept of reflexes. So infants are actually born with certain protective reflexes. So infants come out knowing how to suck, swallow, and breathe. They actually start doing some of these things very late in the womb with the amniotic fluid and starting to practice, so they're ready when they come out. Even though they have these natural reflexes, it's still really important to remind moms, especially those that are breastfeeding, that they still have to learn how to latch and learn how to breastfeed, even though they have some of these reflexes in the womb. Okay. This is in your book, so I just kind of want you to be familiar with it. We are in the sensory motor for the stages of cognitive development. And so babies are like little sponges. That's kind of what this is. They are learning by looking at things, listening, touching, viewing. They interact with their environment, and it's really how they start to understand things. However, they don't understand object permanence until about 9 months, which is why peekaboo is such a fun game, because they legitimately perceive that you have left. Okay, so let's talk about the nutrition component. I will go ahead and tell you I love infant feeding. I think it's a super fun topic. Babies are super fun to feed, but there are, as having been a parent, I can see how stressful it is to start to introduce solid foods, especially with growing concerns about allergies and the types of food we're giving our babies. So I'm hoping that the menu planning assignment that I give you will help kind of make that a reality. So as we said, during that 3rd trimester, infants start to learn to swallow so they can learn that reflex, typically with the amniotic fluid. Now, what I would like to point out there is because they swallow amniotic fluid, we actually know from research that what mom consumes food-wise can actually give the amniotic fluid a flavor, not super strong, but we actually know that babies tend to have food preferences when they come out based on what mom ate. Now, I will go ahead and say that the infant GI tract is not fully developed until around 6 months, which is why we don't recommend starting solid foods until that time. You will see that some babies may be ready a little earlier than that, but we have to be really cautious and remind people that breastfeeding is best until 6 months, breastfeeding exclusively. Or if we're formula feeding exclusively, not adding things to the bottle, which is a very common thing around here. When the baby is born, the digestive system is actually only capable of breaking down fats, proteins, and simple sugars. So think about your monosaccharides. That is the reason that we don't initially give babies cheese, milk, yogurt. Think about that. That's lactose. Their body cannot break that down. Now, context is what I'm hoping to give you here when we're thinking about how much a baby needs to be full. On day one of a newborn, that baby's belly is only the size of like a marble. So thinking back to breastfeeding, remember that in the first 2 or 3 days, while mother's milk is starting to come in, mom secretes colostrum, which is like liquid gold. It's the best food ever. It is full of antibodies. It is super, super rich and thick. A lot of times it actually does look gold-like, like it's kind of yellow fluid. So moms are always concerned that they're not, because they're not producing milk, that colostrum is not going to fill baby's belly. Here's the thing. That baby's belly is only the size of a marble. It's not going to take a lot to fill it. Now on day 3, we're as big as a ping pong ball. So maybe we've started to eat a little bit more, but if you think about that, milk's coming in, we're making room for it. And then on day 10, we're thinking an extra large chicken egg, okay? So definitely when mom is secreting colostrum, that baby's belly is so little, but as the milk starts to come in, it increases stomach capacity. Okay, so we talked a little bit about those reflexes, and one thing we also know about infants that's super interesting is that infants are actually able to regulate their own food intake. They will let you know when they are done, and they will, especially when they start doing solid food, they absolutely will push things off the table and get fussy when they're done. But even when they're doing formula or breastfeeding, when they are no longer interested in taking that bottle or that breast, they are absolutely done. And so it's very important for their own self-regulation. We know that when infants let people know that they're done and we push past that and continue to feed them to try to get their belly to stay full longer, we are actually disregarding those natural cues. And over time, those cues that are natural, that are born in us, actually stop working as well. And some researchers have concluded that that may be the start of babies becoming overweight and obese and it trending into adulthood, is disregarding those natural cues we're born with. So it's very important when babies are done, babies are done. The eating schedule should be entirely dictated by the infant. So moms sometimes get caught up in their brain. They're like, oh my God, my baby hasn't eaten for 2.5 hours. I will tell you that I definitely would pay attention to the clock. It is so easy to think, okay, they're ready to eat again. But really, we need to look for those cues. We need to look for those reflexes. So we'll talk about what those are in just a minute. We've talked a little bit about rooting, and when you touch their cheek, they turn towards because they're looking for that breast. But just remember that eating schedule should be dictated by the infant. And on that thought process, one thing we have to tell moms is cluster feeding is totally normal. So cluster feeding is this concept that when a baby shifts all of a sudden, for no rhyme or reason, from feeding every 2 to 3 hours to all of a sudden eating every hour, like they're starving and they're dying, and they will do it for 10 to 12 hours at a time sometimes. Now, I will tell you, having experienced this myself, that is the most frustrating, concerning thing that will ever happen to you. I remember sitting and just crying, feeding Jack and thinking, when is this baby going to be done after 6 hours? So it can be a very emotionally stressful thing for parents. So it's very helpful for them to know cluster feeding can happen. Part of what it is that increasing stomach capacity. All of a sudden they have new capacity and they're like, I'm hungry, let's fill that stomach. So just reminding them that these are things that can happen, particularly in young infants. So some things about feeding skills. So it's really important that we talk to parents about positioning. A lot of reasons. I mean, I'm sure choking comes to mind, but one thing too we can think about is bottles being in a semi-upright with the baby kind of inclined a little bit. Why that is we know that pooling can occur. So we don't want this concept of milk sitting at the back of the baby's mouth, because when the milk pools at the back of the ears, that risk of ear infections increases. So we do want them to be a little bit inclined. The other big thing that is really common in the South, I see it all the time, and it just breaks my heart. And I've taught myself not to interfere, but propping bottles is a huge no-no. Two reasons. One is parent is not paying attention to baby cues at all. We are saying, you are hungry, you will eat X amount, okay? And it will be propped. You're not paying attention to baby as well. So let's say baby's done, baby's trying to push the bottle away, can't push the bottle away, forcing, still continuing for baby to drink, which could cause that possible choking and discomfort. Also, it's really important that parents are paying attention to their baby during feeding to watch for those cues. So there are a lot of reasons why propping a bottle is a huge no-no, and it should never be done. When we start introducing solid foods via spoon, it's very important that the baby has to be able to sit upright and has somewhat good head and neck control. As you can see here, this baby's able to kind of lean to the side and lean forward. I will say that even sometimes when you start feeding, they seem a little wobbly and they seem like that high chair is way too big for them. But it's really important for their development. They're able to sit up so they can sit at that inclined position and control their head and neck. All right, so we're going to introduce solid foods. Typically, this is appropriate around 6 months, but I always encourage parents to pay attention to their kids and pay attention to cues. And so some of the cues that you can look for to know your baby is ready, the big one we just talked about is sitting up with little support. So they're able to sit in a high chair and they're able to do it without falling from one side to the other. All of those things are really important. Actually, with my youngest son, we started sitting him at the table with us for family meals before he was even ready to eat, to get him used to sitting in the high chair and to start to gauge how he was doing on sitting up, as well as just being with family. Like, this is a normal family meal time. Another thing that can happen is when you see babies kind of protrude their tongue and stick it out and move it from side to side, and that can let you know that they are getting ready to want to feed. Now, part of what that is what we call the tongue thrust reflex. And this may actually be in your navigate question. So a baby is born with a tongue thrust reflex, and it's when their tongue extends out when the lips are touched. And if this is still a really strong reflex and you're trying to feed a baby solid food, they'll have a difficult time keeping the food in the mouth, because every time you bring that spoon to the lip, they'll protrude that tongue out. So if we start to see them moving tongue side to side, we know that that reflex is kind of waning away. The other thing is the gag reflex. So babies are born to protect them from swallowing inappropriate foods with a really strong gag reflex. Actually, and if an object touches the back of the tongue, that object is then propelled forward. And so imagine if you're trying to feed a baby that is too young and still has a really strong gag reflex, everything's going to come out anyways. So it's important to start to get used to that. Wait, I want to go back because I want to talk about this. Once we know baby is ready for solid foods, they typically adapt really quickly. It is really important to feed your baby when they show their hunger cues, and not wait until they are too upset. Very similar to breastfeeding and bottle feeding when we're doing that exclusively. If your baby is so hungry, he is upset, it is not going to be a good experience for anybody. Some of the things you might see is if the baby gets really excited when they actually see the food coming, that can let you know baby is hungry. If they start to really clench their fists or reach for the spoon from you, that can let you know they're hungry. Even, and I always think this is funny and it's not funny, but if they start crying or fussing, if you're feeding them really too slow, that lets you know they're still hungry. Now, on the back end of that, we need to be looking when we're feeding them for that satiation cue as well. So they've slowed their pace of eating. So thinking about they're excited, they're eating really fast, they start to slow down. when they start playing with their food, even though that's totally normal. But if they're more interested in playing with the food, the bowl, the spoon, we may be starting to get full. And then sometimes even they will refuse to open their mouth, they'll spit food out, they'll knock the bowl over. Those are signs that baby is done, and do not try to force feed them. You want to pay attention to their cues there. So here are some common food items. I'm not going to go through and read this to you. This will be really helpful to have this chart whenever you do your menu planning assignment. But just thinking about the types of foods that we offer, here are some important things to know. First of all, we want food to be offered from a spoon. One of the big trendy items right now is to have the little pouches. And fortunately, what's happening, even though those are great for on the go, what's happening is parents are using them and just squirting the food into the infant's mouth, and the infant is not learning how to eat with a spoon. So it's very important that if you are not out on the go, that you take the time to put the pouch into a bowl and use a spoon to feed the baby. The other thing is typically we only want to feed about 1 to 2 tablespoons of solid food for each meal, maybe 1 or 2 times a day to start. A lot of times I would do it with our natural meal times that we were sitting down as a family anyways, because babies, once again, are sponges and are picking up on those social cues to help build in those natural meal times. But when babies start eating solid food, it's majority of their cacao protein needs are still coming from the milk. It's not until we get to these 10 to 12 months in 1 year that we should see that swap happen where their solid food should be taking in more cacao. And what you'll actually see then is the amount of feedings for milk will decrease. They may take in a lot at one time, but they won't do it as frequently during the day because they're looking to those meals. The other thing is you want to introduce foods one at a time. So the first best thing to typically do is rice cereal mixed in with a little breast milk or a little formula, and keeping it very, very consistency wise to where it like drips off the spoon. You want it to be very similar. As time goes on and baby does better, you can increase the thickness of it, but that first 6 months feeding, you want it to be very, very thin. Maybe baby does really well with rice cereal for a couple of weeks and you decide you want to add a little bit of applesauce into the rice cereal to introduce that. You don't want to introduce mixed food items initially in case baby has an allergic reaction. You want to try each food individually. Typically the recommendation is when you introduce a new food, you give it 3 to 5 days before introducing another new food. Another thing that we think about is drinking from a cup. And so we can start to introduce a cup around 6 months of age. A lot of parents do it at that meal time. They'll offer a cup of water or a small cup of breast milk or formula. And it's not so much that we're expecting them to gain extra fluid at this time. It's more, once again, those social cues, and this is kind of what's expected. And if they spill it, it's not a big deal. But we should expect that at 10 to 12 months, infants are able to pick up cups and move around their tongue and actually drink out of the cups. And you're still continuing to breastfeed, but you're able to integrate the cup to prepare them for that 1-year-old transition. Okay, so we talked a little bit about food preferences with the amniotic fluid. The other thing we know is breast milk. It can be flavored based on what mom is eating. And so a lot of times our breastfed infants are also exposed to a wider variety of tastes. So after they get used to those initial food items, they may be looking for foods that have a little bit more variety in them because of the fact that they were exposed to more. Typically, they're more accepting of new foods during the 6 to 7 month range. They'll try almost anything. But if you start to introduce a lot of new foods at 12 months, they can tend to be a little bit pickier. They're starting to develop their personality. But typically, as an infant, they will eat pretty much anything. Now, preferences are largely learned. So it's important that parents, even if you don't like peas, that you try to feed your baby peas. And trying to remember your own biases and prejudice with that. Babies are naturally predisposed to sweet taste and to stay away from bitter taste. And so it may be helpful to start with vegetables before fruits. They're naturally going to like those fruits and they may stick up their nose to the vegetables because they're looking for that sweet taste. So one thing to think about is how much food does a baby actually need? We do have some EERs for babies. We actually know that newborns require about 100 kcals per kilogram of body weight. So thinking about how we did our calculations for protein, you would take that baby's weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2 to get kilograms, and times it by about 100. As the baby grows, we know that they're going to need more energy. And so that's why you see these different equations based on age. As far as distribution in calories, we actually want to see a lot more calories from fat, about 40 to 50%. Very little protein, only about 7 to 11%, and the remainder is carbohydrates. So they really have a high carb, high fat diet that they need. But if they are taking in breast milk, they are getting a ton of healthy fats. So typically triglycerides are the major energy source. And as we said, we need to get baby essential fatty acids such as that EPA and DHA. That means mom must take in the fatty acids if she's breastfeeding. A lot of times infant formulas will be supplemented with EPA and DHA. For carbohydrates, typically, like we said, simple sugar is what their body can process initially. And so typically glucose is what's really needed. It's needed for proper growth and development. We don't want to see that growth stunting that would occur in the case that baby was taking in a lower carbohydrate diet. Protein, as we said, protein, even though the body of the baby is building, only about 7 to 11% of the daily intake is protein, and we do it very similar to the energy here. But if you notice, if you remember from 219, our protein calculation is 0.8 for adults. So babies definitely are looking at more proteins per gram per kilogram of body weight. Some other vitamins and minerals that are important to remember. Vitamin D. So exclusively breastfed infants will need vitamin D supplementation. Typically you get it in like a little dropper. You can give it to your baby. The deficiency can lead to rickets, which is similar to like an osteomalacia for adults. The bones are not formed properly during this extreme time of growth and development. And as you see here, you get this bow-legged look. Iron, we talked about iron time and time again, but it's very important that formula-fed infants make sure that parents are choosing a formula that is iron fortified. But we also want to make sure that moms that are breastfeeding are also not experiencing iron deficiency anemia, so they're able to give adequate amounts of iron to baby. And we do know that iron deficiencies in infants can cause irreversible behavioral and brain function abnormalities. So that iron is extremely, extremely critical for babies. Fiber. So when we start introducing fiber food, or when we start introducing solid foods, we want to make sure that we start introducing foods that contain fiber. So that rice cereal initially does not contain a lot of fiber, but as they do really well with that, you can introduce other types of cereal like oat and barley, which does have fiber. And of course, the fruits and vegetables do as well, but it's really important that we get them up to about 5 grams of fiber per day. Typically, remember, our water needs are met through the breast milk or formula, and we don't want them to take in too much water. Offering water from time to time with those babies that are closer to a year with their meals in the cup is fine, but mostly our hydration needs are met. We actually we keep an eye on this, just monitoring for signs of dehydration, and that can include reduced amount of wet diapers, that can include dry membranes in the nose and the mouth, baby is crying, no tears are produced, sometimes we even see sunken eyes, and baby just in general being extremely restless or irritable. So some common nutrition considerations during infancy that you might hear parents talking about a little bit. One thing that I feel like we talk a lot about in the last probably 20 to 30 years is colic. We actually know that there's no specific cause. However, we can typically diagnose it by this rule of 3. So is baby crying for more than 3 hours per day, more than 3 days a week, and for more than 3 weeks? So it really has to be occurring in a really chronic manner if you think about it. And then typically before they diagnose with colic, they will check to make sure the baby is not deficient in any other ways. They're not a failure to thrive. And so they're otherwise a healthy baby. They just are crying in this rule of 3 almost inconsolably. And the treatment can really vary, and it's very infant specific. Some infants do well with probiotics. Oddly enough, bananas, when moms consume it that are breastfeeding, tend to really bother babies. I had a friend that had to remove all dairy from her diet while she was breastfeeding because that caused her baby to have colic. As soon as she did, baby no longer had colic. So it is really specific on how the infant does with colic, and there can be a lot of trial and error before they find something that works, or sometimes the baby just grows out of it. Some other things that can happen, so we've already talked about the fact that the baby's GI system is not even fully developed until 6 months, and so before that, only simple sugars. But it's really important to remember that the body does not naturally produce lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose. And so it's actually synthesized from our gut microbiome. And so giving babies lactose before they're ready can create these lactose intolerant symptoms, and it can be really dangerous. Now, there's also a possibility that baby could be lactose intolerant, and typically this is done through trying lactose-free formula to see if the baby has less GI symptoms, less colic-like symptoms. But this is actually really rare for this to actually be a lactose intolerance. We see a lot more parents going to those allergen-friendly formulas that are really, really expensive. But the reality is that this is pretty rare. Constipation is really common in babies, and we tend to see it more frequently in formula-fed infants. And we don't want to give our babies any true medication to treat constipation unless prescribed by the pediatrician. The other thing is for some odd reason, parents are feeding their infants fruit juice. Another thing I've often heard is adding corn syrup to their bottles, to their milk to get them to go to the bathroom, adding in prune juice too early before their system can handle it. And so it's really important that parents are not doing these at-home practices because it can either really shift to diarrhea or shift to an extreme constipation. And so we want them to be taken to the pediatrician and given some instruction from the pediatrician about chronic constipation. Diarrhea we typically see with an infection like a rotavirus. And once again, we're concerned about adequate hydration and avoiding dehydration. So it is important to know that a lot of parents are making the choice to choose to feed their children vegetarian diets, sometimes even vegan diets. You will see parents choose to do a soy formula. The important thing, particularly in children, to know and be ready to educate on is that in order to do this and have a child grow healthy, it's really important that some careful planning on the part of the parents are done. Because of the fact that we know that there can be serious vitamin deficiencies, in particular protein, getting in enough of those essential fatty acids, iron, calcium, vitamin D, B12. So it is extremely important for these infants to be closely followed to avoid any deficiencies. And that is all. There are a few things at the end of the chapter about lifestyle, but for the most part, those are the big things. And we will really be focusing on the infant feeding perspective in class.